Hello, everyone. My name is Sara Pantuliano. I'm the Chief Executive here at ODI. Thank you so much for joining us today ahead of the G7 Leaders Summit to talk about how we can all rise to the global vaccine challenge to finally beat this deadly pandemic. I'm really delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel of speakers. I'll introduce them shortly, but I just want to remind the audience, first of all, that we will be taking questions and comments from all of you during our Q&A session at the end, in the second part of the webinar. So please use the chat box below to feed your inputs and ask your questions during the discussion. But also, let's make sure that we engage on Twitter, and we have this discussion through the hashtag ODI vaccination, and remember to tag the ODI_global handle, please. I think this conversation comes at a really critical moment, considering that India and a number of other countries are going to a really devastating third wave. And India in particular is a major vaccine exporter, but it's clear that we continue to have some fairly critical barriers to vaccine equity. And we have new variants continuously threatening global and local recovery efforts. So I think there's perhaps never been a public policy challenge where national and international interests are so closely aligned. We've heard the UK Prime Minister, recently saying that he will urge G7 leaders to vaccinate the world against COVID by the end of next year. And in many ways, the success of this summit will really be judged primarily on whether concrete measures are agreed to accelerate the global response to the pandemic. And big actions are needed. I mean, we've heard from the IMF, there's estimated $50 billion being needed to really support this effort. But so far, the commitments are short of about 31 billion. We've seen 200 current and former leaders writing to the G7 to urge them to really contribute 2/3 of the sums needed. And the IMF and others really urging high-income countries to share 1 billion doses of the vaccine by the end of 2021. But so far, we've seen only 225 million doses being pledged. So what do countries battling the virus and struggling to vaccinate people need? And how can the G7 and others rise to this global challenge? I couldn't think of a better group of speakers to be with us today to help navigate this challenge and answer some of these questions. So let me introduce them. I'll start with Marie-Ange Saraka-Yeo. Marie-Ange is the Managing Director for Resource Mobilisation, Private Sector Partnerships and Innovative Finance at Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. Since joining Gavi in 2011, Marie-Ange's leadership has helped raise the largest amount of resources ever for Gavi. She's the lead negotiator with G7 and G20 leaders, with corporations and with high net worth individuals that really are driving the expansion of Gavi's investors base. Ashok Malik is the policy advisor in the Ministry of External Affairs of the Government of India, where he works closely with the Foreign Secretary. Ashok is also part of the Empowered Group, the interministerial institutional process that has been set up by the Government of India to address specific aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic response. And last but not least, Jeremy Kunindick. Jeremy is the Executive Director of the COVID-19 Task Force at USAID. Prior to this role, Jeremy was a Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development and previously served in the Obama administration as the Director of USAID's Office of U.S. Foreign Disasters Assistance, OFDA. He actually, in that position, led the response to a number of international crises, and notably the epidemic in West Africa the Ebola epidemic between 2014 and 2016. It is a real privilege to have all of you with us today. Thank you all for joining us. It's a busy week for the three of you, so I'm particularly grateful for you taking the time. Let me first turn to Ashok. Ashok, the situation in India is dire. Can you tell us a little bit, concretely about the reality of the crisis, but also how can international partners help? You're on mute.
Sorry, am I audible? Great. Thank you for having me here, Sarah, and thank you to ODI for organizing this. And hi, Marie and Jeremy. It's glad to meet you electronically. I would have liked to have met you in person, and I would like to have been in London today, but never mind. We do it another time. Coming to the situation in India, it's a little ironical that the number of new cases in India today is 90,000. And we are actually sighing in relief because this is way below the second surge peak of 425,000 new cases a day. And yet, if you go back to our first wave, which concluded around December 2020, it peaked at exactly this number, 90,000 new cases a day. And this should give you an idea about the intensity of the second wave. We had perhaps planned or modeled for twice the number of people falling ill to the coronavirus as it had happened in the first wave. But the numbers went up by a factor of over 4. Why did this happen? It was a perfect storm of multiple factors. I guess there was pandemic fatigue, and as the first wave numbers plummeted, people began to go out to work, to meet friends, to the market, and so on and so forth. And maybe we all became a little complacent. Second, we started our vaccination program for specific high-risk groups in January, which was exactly when the numbers fell. And that again led to complacency that didn't lead to vaccine hesitancy as much as a sense that we could always get vaccines a few months down the line, and it wasn't that urgent. That sense of urgency wasn't there. Third, we were hit in different geographies in the country by 3 different mutations, 3 variants, each of which was significantly more transmissible than the original coronavirus variant. We are not certain they were more lethal, but they were certainly more transmissible. And that led to a perfect storm. The number of health facilities, the sheer volume of medical equipment, medical oxygen production in the country between the first surge and the second surge had gone up about between 70 and 80%. But even that just wasn't enough because we were dealing with numbers that were overwhelming. And very frankly, if there is a third wave or another wave of this nature in any country, I don't think any system is geared towards dealing with literally millions of new patients coming into the hospital or wanting to come into the hospital system every week after week. So the race now is between vaccination and a third wave. A third wave will come. How intense it will be and how damaging it will be depends on how many people can get vaccinated. And that's where we are. Towards the beginning of our vaccination program, we had enough vaccines to make our contribution to COVAX, to give to other countries as bilateral grants, as well as to allow our companies to make commercial sales. And we actually sent out 66 million vaccines. But now it's proving to be a problem because immediately there is an urgency and within the country, and more and more people are lining up to get vaccinated. And frankly, there is a supply side problem rather than a demand side problem. We hope that will be remedied in the months ahead, but that's where we are.
Thanks, Ashok. That really sort of hits the nail on the head. Marie-Ange, you've heard from Ashok, it's a race between vaccination and the third wave, but there is also obviously a problem in terms of supply. Can you tell us a little bit about the scale of the financing gap for vaccines, and then perhaps later in the discussion we can also talk about the production and the supply, but the financing gap?
No, I think, I think Ashok presented very well the situation in India. And I think what this situation shows is, of course, the threat borne by various mutations. And that threat is quite important. So clearly, when we think about the strategy, it's about, of course, minimizing the risk for this new variant by protecting the most vulnerable everywhere, really, from the most severe cases of the disease, but also expanding that, limiting the spread of the virus through expanded vaccination coverage. So clearly immunization is key here, but what matters coming to financing is the importance of contingent financing, having financing early, because clear and a diversified portfolio to be, of course, able to respond differently to the demand. And that's particularly why the Gavi COVAX Advanced Market Commitment was created, in a sense, as an innovative finance mechanism to 92 low and middle income economies, including India, to basically enter early on into an advanced purchase agreement, reserve doses to be able to deliver later. So, part of the promise of COVAX has been, in a sense, achieved by being able to deliver the doses, let's say, 80 days after they were actually delivered in higher income economies, compared to the previous crisis where it was more than a year. But clearly, as we have heard, and Ashok said it very well, you still have this threat of variants and the difficulties of supply. And I think that's where, in a sense, when we look at the financing, we do have to have several scenarios, because there are different scenarios of the evolution of the disease. I mean, on the positive side, as you probably heard, we have now just closed a successful financing round, and thanks to the support of the US and Japan, obviously, for the for COVAX AMC to have 1.8 billion doses this year to be delivered by the end of the year until the beginning of next year, so that should allow to cover roughly 30% of the population of these 92 countries, which is important because it represents half of the adult population. We have to remember that these countries have an adult population that is, of course, younger than in most high-income countries. So 30% is a meaningful number. But of course, we do need to continue, because we need to limit the spread of the disease. And there, of course, it depends much on the evolution, on if we need boosters, right? In terms of immunity, and this we are not quite sure yet. So you have various figures. If you consider boosters and you want to go to 60% of coverage in AMC countries, that represent the adult population, and depending on, let's say an average price of $7, you could go to 23 billion. Of course, if you consider that you need less boosters or boosters just for the kind of, high risk population, you have at the other lower range, 10 billion. The point is that the numbers are important, but most importantly, we have to work on several aspects. Indeed, getting the financing early, and that's really what's important. Getting, of course, the supply, because as Ashok was indicating, there are issues of supply, and in the immediate term, what's important is very important, the dose sharing element, so to complement the supply, and we are very hopeful for the G7 in that regard. But of course, also we shouldn't forget what's important, also the role of countries being ready. It's really, I think it's really important, Sarah, to understand that it requires work from all of us. Of course, from the donors, from the countries, from the manufacturers, but preparing also to receive the largest ever immunization campaign will be important. And there are needs in terms of helping the countries prepare.
I'll come back to you on that later, Mariage, but let me go to Jeremy to ask, you heard about the critical issues being around financing and supply. What can the US, what can other G7 countries do, to help with the two critical aspects of this? Tell us what you're doing leading the USA task force on COVID-19. I'm sure that is what you're focusing on every day.
It is. I probably am. Vaccines and oxygen are probably the two things that occupy most of my time these days, and I think that makes sense, because vaccines are what will save lives in in an increasing way until the end of this year, but really I think in a large way next year as the supply really comes online globally at scale. And oxygen is what saves lives in the immediate term when we see surges, as Ashok referenced. So it is a huge preoccupation. President Biden will be making some announcements, and the G7 leaders will be making some announcements on this at the summit. One thing I think I can say now, because it's been publicly reported and the White House fact sheet has gone live, is one of the key ways we'll be doing this is, as President Biden is announcing, the 500 million dose commitment to Gavi of Pfizer doses that the U.S. will be procuring, and that critically is obviously a very large number of doses, but also the sequencing is really important. So one of the challenges that Gavi has had is the kind of the different doses from different producers come online at different times, and because of the situation in India, much of the Indian supply that Gavi had relied upon is now needed for domestic use in India. And so we see this Pfizer contribution as an important way to kind of fill some of that gap until the Indian supply to Gavi can come back online. And so it's really critically important that of the 500 million doses, 200 million of those will be available this calendar year, starting later in the summer. And so that will help to fill some of the supply gap on Gavi's side. One of the other major steps we're taking there, as the president announced a few weeks ago, is beginning to share U.S.-owned doses from our own supply. And so the president has made an initial commitment of 80 million doses. And we expect that could grow as we get additional deliveries and we see continued improvement in vaccination coverage rates here in our country. So we don't have new numbers, but I think it's plausible we'll be able to go beyond that. And we're also doing things like investing in expanding the manufacturing base for vaccines globally. And so through the Quad commitment that Japan, US, India, and Australia made a few months ago, we're putting financing through our Development Finance Corporation into expanding vaccine production in India at a scale that should produce an extra billion doses. We're also seeking other opportunities. The DFC is partnering with the International Finance Corporation and some of its other peer development finance bodies to also pursue opportunities to expand manufacturing in Africa. We see that as critically important. Obviously, the African Union has called for this. I think what we see with the situation in India and the situation in other large countries that are vaccine producers is, there is a strong, when vaccines are being produced predominantly in countries that themselves have large populations that need those vaccines, it's very politically difficult to both kind of meet domestic needs and send those abroad. So diversifying and expanding the production base for vaccines globally is going to be very, very important. So we're investing in that as well, both initially in India for global export, but also actively exploring opportunities in Africa. And we're also quite focused on the supply chain for vaccine inputs. And what we've seen so far is that's actually the biggest bottleneck right now. There is more production capacity than is being used right now in the world because so many of the producers rely on a small set of companies that produce these single-use consumable items for vaccine production, and there are just not enough of those in the world. And so we're also looking at exploring ways to expand the production of those and optimize the use of those to expand and accelerate the number of available vaccines. And the last thing I'd point to is just the financing piece. So obviously the president's announcement today is a big step forward on vaccine procurement financing, but I think we are really literally leaving money on the table with the structure of how some of the multilateral development banks put together their initial vaccine financing. The Asian Development Bank put $9 billion on the table for countries. The World Bank put $12 billion on the table. Others have put some on the table, but very, very little of that has actually translated into deals. And I think it speaks to some pretty significant design flaws in how that money was originally conceived, and I hope prompts some reflection in the multilateral development banks about that. I mean, it's not the first time we have seen the MDBs struggling, frankly, to move money out the door in a timely way when faced with a serious disease outbreak. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. And it's fantastic to hear of all the commitments that have already been leaked and perhaps more to come, and all the work that the US is doing, to really accelerate, this global response. But Ashok, maybe, to come to you, what can other G7 countries do? What are you expecting or hoping to hear, from G7 leaders this weekend?
Thanks. I agree with almost everything Jeremy said, and he's pointed to how absolutely heartwarming international cooperation has been over the past year. Countries have sent each other medicines. India sent medicines. The US sent us oxygen. We've all tried to help, but frankly, we've also all struggled because, as Jeremy said, capacities are limited. If you look at recent vaccine rollouts, there were vaccines meant for specific populations, so children or adolescent girls perhaps, or certain categories of adults. This is a vaccine which we all expect will be universally delivered. That's potentially 8 billion people in the world. And with booster shots, that's multiples of 8 billion. And we need more diversified capacities, not just for vaccine manufacture, but as Jeremy suggested, for ingredient manufacture. One of the things that occupies us in the Indian Foreign Office is tying up ingredient supplies for the 3 COVID vaccines being made in India currently, and roughly half a dozen more vaccines that are in various stages of development, and we hope will be manufactured in India this calendar year, or maybe early next year, but perhaps this calendar year. Now, as you can imagine, these vaccines use literally hundreds of ingredients. Some of these are produced in India. Many of these are produced in other countries. We have a list of 380 ingredients used collectively by all these vaccines, the supplies of which are stressed. About 200 of them are from the United States, another 100 from Germany, and then you have 2 from Poland, 1 from Singapore, 1 from Denmark. And why are these supplies stressed? It's not because people are denying us these. In some countries, you do have temporary export bans because they prioritized their own manufacture. But the biggest problem is you've suddenly seen demand go up from 0 to 8 billion. And small companies or specialized companies do not have the ability or the capacity to ramp up production of their specific ingredient in a matter of months. And quite frankly, if I were a small company in, let's say, California or in Warsaw, I would wonder, do I want to put in lots of money to expanding capacity for one specific ingredient when I don't know how long the COVID vaccine market will last? Will it last for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? I don't know. Will a bank give me a commercial loan to fund that expansion? What about mRNA vaccines? We know need cold chains, need extra special cold chains. To get a Pfizer vaccine or a Moderna vaccine to Africa is a great idea. But do they have the cold chains there? And how long do they need to invest in cold chains? It's what I'm trying to suggest is it's not just the end vaccine that we need to put money into, for the manufacturer which we need to put money into. It's the entire vaccine pipeline from ingredients to arms that needs to be expanded. And we will need to build in redundancies. We will need to, it's like investing in an oxygen concentrator for your house and never needing to use it. It's at one level you may consider it a wasted investment. At another level you should be glad you never got to use it. The world will have to come together to build redundancies into every inch of the vaccine pipeline, from ingredients to vaccines themselves, to of course storage and cold chains. And this is going to call for something much more strategic than conventional advanced market commitments for vaccines. Because as I said, those were needed for specific demographics or specific groups or smaller populations. This is something which is going to be universal and probably there for multiple years.
I couldn't agree more, Ashok. Marianne, I mean, Ashok says we need to invest in the entire vaccine pipeline. And you were saying before how actually part of the problem is the readiness, particularly in low-income countries that so far have vaccinated barely 1% of their population. So what can we do to reach this target, to move, as Ashok says, to something more strategic, more global, actually, that can really lift the effort?
No, I think that my point is that there needs to be efforts at several levels in parallel. I think one of the key things that Ashok just said right now is the contingent financing is very important, but it's also financing at risk. One of the big reasons why capacity was not developed early enough, that a lot of countries were not investing at risk, and there was this concern, or even institutions. And in a sense, that what then leads to this kind of supply shortage where you wait until to know more, and eventually there's not enough supply. So really, the upfront funding to reserve doses, to expand the capacity early on, and indeed to be able to have redundancies and not just think that, because you need in sense to have the flexibility to move. That's the one thing. The other part, of course, for the countries is really indeed to invest in their system. And a lot has been done. We have been working with our donors, including USAID and other agencies, to start preparing the countries. But ultimately, indeed, if you look back at the beginning, you had first one vaccine that was pre-qualified, and then others. So you do need to think also about the country absorption capacity and capacity to, in a sense, adapt to the variety of vaccine that we have. And now we are lucky because we have several of them, but it requires various level of preparedness. And I think that now has to be now that we know the vaccine is there, that the vaccines are coming, doses are coming, and thank you, Jeremy, for all the efforts and the US. The focus really needs to be on the delivery in parallel, so that when these doses arrive in countries, they are not idle, right? One point also that I want to make, and that is important, of course, that Jeremy hinted at too, is that in the front loading of contingent financing, indeed, is also leveraging the capacity of each organization. The advantage of COVAX indeed has been to be able to reserve in advance with the funding received. It's true that the multilateral development bank, with a country model that is more a retail model, is a model that works when actually the vaccine is already plenty available in big quantity, because the investment comes much later. So now it's about bridging these two types of investments so that we can leverage and get that investment earlier to the point of making it actually much more productive. And that will be important, but also to support the countries, because they do have a country model that can help to support the system in countries. So I think that will be that will be quite important. But of course, also for the country readiness, we should not forget that one of the strengths also of the immunization system is that the routine immunization system before the pandemic has grown a lot, has strengthened thanks to the investment of a lot of partners and donors like USAID. And it's actually building on this system now to stretch it to, in a sense, receive the volume of vaccines. If I hear from my health colleagues, we are going to roll over 4 times the volume of vaccine that we typically roll in country. So this is a major endeavor, also building on a very strong immunization system. That has been the strength of our partnership with India. For example, we have 20 years of partnership with India that was really built on the most extraordinary immunization system. And that's how we have been able to introduce 6 new vaccines, reduce the number of unimmunized by 40% in 5 years. So it's feasible, but it's really building, working on all these things, not just one aspect. It's really working in parallel in these various dimensions.
Thanks, Marianne. I was going to come to Jeremy actually with the same question that one of my colleagues from ODI has also just come from the audience. We clearly think alike. So I was going to ask you exactly the same, picking up on your point before. But Mark Miller, who is our director of the Public and Development Finance team at ODI, is asking Jeremy, he's keen to understand more about what MDBs could be doing to make sure that the money on the table is translated into vaccination programs. What has gone wrong? What are the barriers? And, is it reasonable to expect the low-income countries, to borrow for vaccine given global benefits? And just a reminder that after this, I'm opening more widely to the Q&A. So do put your questions in the chat.
Yeah, it's an important question. So is it reasonable to expect LICs to borrow? I think, to a point, yes, not exclusively. And that's why COVAX exists. That's why the U.S. government is providing as much support to COVAX as we are, and why we've been encouraging others to do more. And COVAX now, even prior to the new U.S. commitment of Pfizer, COVAX had raised $9.5 billion, I believe, at the last, as of the end of the last funding round. So the world has put close to $10 billion and still growing into Gavi so far for COVAX, for support to low-income countries to make sure that their most at-risk populations and then some can be covered. I do think, though, yes, there are global benefits. Yes, I always want to see wealthy countries continuing to provide more support. And in the U.S. has provided more than anyone in terms of absolute dollars on this. But the benefits also accrue to the countries themselves. So I think as a kind of reason to take on debt to meet a one-off short-term cost that is a major posing major economic risks and is a solvable problem, that's a reasonable thing to incur debt for, I think. And I think countries are interested in doing that. The challenge, as I understand it, with the way the financing has been structured from the multilateral development banks, is that if you're a small country, it's a lot of hoops to jump through to take a loan, figure out the manufacturer you want to buy from. The World Bank put a lot of hurdles. So they had a much higher bar for being able to access that funding than anyone else did. If I recall correctly, it had to be approved by 3 different stringent regulatory authorities. Whereas with Gavi, it only had to be approved by either a stringent regulatory authority or have WHO emergency license. So the World Bank made it much harder for countries to access that money. It also fragmented the money. So what COVAX attempts to do, and what, say, the EU attempted to do, and what the US, for our states attempted to do, was to procure centrally and then allocate. And I think the distinction that I draw is between how the US did our vaccine program this year and how we did our PPE support last year. So a year ago, when the US was in a bad situation, the government at the time left the PPE procurement to each individual state, and it was chaos, and it created competition, and it didn't send clear signals to the market. We didn't do that with vaccines. With vaccines, the federal government procured and then allocated to the states based on a formula. Well, the way that the World Bank's money has worked for countries, or not worked, as the case may be, looks a lot more like the way PPE worked a year ago than the way vaccines worked a year ago here in the US. It is fragmenting demand, which means you're not sending a clear signal of demand to manufacturers. You're not sending assurance of financing to manufacturers. And in the conversations I've had with pharma companies, they've identified that as a big problem. That, the fact that there's $12 billion plus of World Bank and $9 billion of Asian Development Bank and billions more from others out there in the theoretical sense doesn't send them, like an individual manufacturer, a clear market signal that there is specific demand for their product with financing attached. So they're going to go to where the deals are that give them that. And that really disadvantages low-income countries as well. So I think that's, that as I understand it, there is a dialogue going on now between COVAX and the World Bank on trying to get to a more consolidation and concentration of demand. We have been pushing them for that from the US side for the last few months, because otherwise it's just, tens of billions of dollars that is going unused on the most important global priority at the moment.
Thanks, Jerry. Marianne, do you want to add something on this COVAX World Bank dialogue?
No, because I'm leading it, of course, with some of Jeremy's colleague. Indeed, that's the intent. To be fair, the World Bank system indeed is based on this retail model that Jeremy was talking about, really by country. So at a time when you need indeed to aggregate, especially for low and middle income country, because one of the value of COVAX is also trying to get a sustainable price, right? That's very important, a negotiating power vis-a-vis manufacturers. So you don't get this. And the problem is that by the time the countries go through the whole loan, in fact, the product is no longer available, because remember, we are in short supply. So people will have already bought it, in fact, at the time of reservation, much before this authorization of 3 regulatory authority. What we see is that people buy the vaccine at the phase 3 trial. So if you are not there, you are not able to put the money at risk, to my point. Later, even if the money is there, you have nothing to buy. It's coming to the supermarket and having an empty shelves. And so we are working indeed to be able to use more of this aggregation. The good thing is that the bank now has approved already 20 projects and plans to approve 50 by the summer. So we are working to have this aggregation indeed to be able to exercise the options that we have on the table from the manufacturers and have then reserve in advance and then be able to provide the countries with additional doses. So that's the work we are doing, and we are hopeful that we'll get there.
So I can't believe I was muted. So we have another question for you, Marie-Ange, on whether COVAX can meet its target of delivering 1.8 billion doses in 2021 without production from India, or are you relying on further donations from the G7 and other countries to achieve this?
Yeah, so part of the additional funding drive that was kindly hosted by the US Secretary Blinken was indeed to be able to diversify the portfolio with to be able to reserve doses from other manufacturers more globally, in a sense to mitigate the situation with India while they go through the process. But at the same time, as you know, we have made this request indeed for more dose sharing in the immediate, especially from now until Q3, to be able to compensate for the shortage of supply. So I think with the money that was just pledged, we should be in a situation to secure the doses and then being able to deliver them up to the beginning of 2022. I think what's important is already to reserve them and be able to have the certainty that they will be there and be able to roll them out in the following month. But we are counting both on with that additional money on diversifying indeed, and you may have seen that we have entered into more APAs with manufacturers recently, thanks to the additional funding received, and we will continue, while at the same time, and I think that's great that we are, the US is showing the leadership there, asking for dose sharing now. What's important in dose sharing is really to have that predictability, because for a country, it's important to know when the doses are coming, because it's also about doing the second dose and completing the full vaccination course for the ones that have started and we could not quite complete given the situation. So having predictability and visibility in the dose sharing will be important.
Thanks, Marie-Ange. We have a question from Vaccine Now. Feel free, Ashok or Jeremy, see if you want to address that. What can the UK presidency do to genuinely raise the ambition on vaccines, particularly where the UK is cutting its other budget? Perhaps without getting into the aid cuts, but what can really the presidency do to really lift this ambition? Jeremy, Ashok, either of you wants to take that?
Ashok, you're muted.
Sorry, if I could take that. I think the UK presidency, to be fair, has indicated an urgency and an energy on not just the COVID vaccine, but on pushing up ambition for vaccines generally to deal with not just this pandemic, but pandemic preparedness generally. And Prime Minister Johnson, in his summit with Prime Minister Modi a few weeks ago, actually spoke about a health partnership and almost a health security compact among countries such as India, the United States, the UK, democracies really, that would be vital to ramp up vaccine manufacture capacities, to diversify and ramp up vaccine manufacture capacities, including in India and other countries, and make these available as quickly as possible to countries across the world, particularly countries in the global south. The UK certainly said the right things and shown the ambition. It's got the research facilities to back up a lot of what needs to be done to actually develop new vaccines. And in fact, even with the COVID-19 vaccine, the AstraZeneca Serum Institute of India program worked on the back of research at Oxford. And I do hope Prime Minister Johnson, during the UK presidency, is able to persuade the rest of the G7 to actually put in more money towards expanding this entire pipeline, as I said.
Thanks. Jeremy, do you want to add anything?
The announcements from the G7 will be coming out, so I don't want to get out ahead of those beyond what's already been publicly shared. But I think there is clearly an intent on the part of the G7 leaders to expand the ambition and kind of accelerate the delivery on global vaccination. And there'll be much more coming out on that, but I won't get ahead of it.
Right, we look forward to hearing more. Marianne, another question for you from Sabrina Nixon at the British Red Cross. She says, can you please tell us a bit more about innovative finance models that are being used in Gavi's COVAX facility, particularly International Finance Facility for Immunization, and how these models are helping to meet the funding gap?
Definitely, and actually I want to use that and make the transition to your earlier question about what the UK can do, because actually the UK has been a leader in this innovative finance mechanism. And when the COVAX AMC was launched, it was launched last year, if you remember, by Prime Minister Boris Johnson at our Global Vaccine Summit. So in a sense, they have shown very early on the willingness to invest in these instruments that are quite important because they allow to basically spread the budgetary, let's say, expenditures over time. That's what the IFI does, right? The government gives you a pledge over 20 years. But instead of waiting 20 years to get the money, you use the money, you go to the capital market and raise the bonds now. So the UK is the leader in IFIM. And actually, that's what they have used for their contribution to COVAX. So it's very important because it helps to invest immediately, even though you may want to spread it over time. But it's also important because it allows actually to invest in other interventions without necessarily putting all your development money in one pot. So it has been critical both for IFIM and also for the advanced market commitment, because the COVAX advanced market commitment is actually derived from another advanced market commitment that we had on pneumonia, where the UK also had invested. And it's actually the first mechanism Gavi had where we were able to introduce a very complex vaccine at the same time in wealthy country and in developing countries. So that's how it was basically the pilot that was very important in helping basically immunize children in low-income countries against pneumonia, which is actually the primary cause of death for children in these countries. And it's a very complex vaccine. So we could test actually the whole mechanism there. And then, of course, when the pandemic started, it felt natural to bring it to a much larger scale and I have to say that it's thanks to the UK leadership there. So a lot that the UK can do in terms of driving, some of this strategic agenda. And of course, Prime Minister Johnson has been calling on vaccinating the world, especially the AMC countries, by end 2022. So we are hopeful, and we know some leaders are already following up. We are hopeful for the G7.
Thanks, Marie-Ange. We have one other question. I may squeeze in one last one after this, because then we have to start wrapping up. So this is from an audience member that doesn't identify themselves, to either of the panelists. What role do you see for Chinese vaccines in the global vaccination campaign, as they're rapidly ramping up production and got WHO approval in the last few weeks? Any of you wants to address that?
Sure, I'm happy to say a few words on that. I think, first, I think it's important that we be driven by the science, both in which vaccines are in use and how they're being used. And so, in that sense, we were disappointed over the past few months to see the degree to which some of the Chinese vaccines were being pushed before they had sought EUL. I mean, we're glad now that it's good that China has kind of met the same standard of transparency that the other major global vaccines in use have by eventually putting its vaccines through EUL at WHO, and we think that process was credible, and it's useful that that we can now rely on the information that's out there about the efficacy of those vaccines, and that they've been open on more open on that. But what's also concerning, I think, about China's vaccine diplomacy is the degree to which they've been doing such overt vaccine diplomacy versus using their vaccines in a way that's driven by public health. And there've been a lot of reports of China seeking to extract political concessions with their vaccines. And I think what President Biden has said very clearly is that that shouldn't be done, and as the U.S. we're not going to do that. That we're not going to be trying to leverage vaccines into political favors or political concessions. That we're going to give our vaccines and provide our vaccine support in a way that is driven by public health and is focused on accelerating the end of the pandemic. And we think all countries should do the same.
Great, Jeremy, Ashok or Marie-Ange, do you want to add anything? And then I'll just do one final round.
No, I think what's important, as Jeremy said, is that now it has gone through the pre-qualification process, through the EUL process. So, of course, we'll have to see as part of the process also, in a sense, what can be made available, through the process that we have, and see how that this can happen. So we have to see indeed how these doses are made available, if they can be made available, relatively quickly to help the crisis, but obviously going through the process that are there and the transparency that is needed.
Thanks, Maria. Sorry,
if I could just add something here, most of the vaccines we've been using and discussing may nominally belong to one country or the other, and may predominantly have been developed in one country, but they are actually international efforts, because, as I said, the supply chain is very intricate and very international, and this supply chain will grow and will become even busier in the years to come. It's important that every segment of the supply chain is driven by market principles and by democratic principles. Because, why do I say that? Because every segment of the supply chain has to be transparent. I have to know clearly what my ingredient supplier is doing, and my customer needs to know what I'm doing. I'd like to emphasize those principles, because those principles are critical as we move ahead in taking on this pandemic and maybe, God forbid, a future one.
Great. Let me come to a final lightning round, 1 minute each. If you had to choose one thing that you really think can make a quantum leap in this global vaccination effort, what do you think that should be? What should be on the top mind of G7 countries as they meet this weekend? Who wants to start? 1 minute each, because we need to wrap up. Two, I can stretch to 2, but no more than that.
I mean, I think the 2 quantum leaps we need and are working towards are addressing and optimizing the supply inputs, and addressing and expanding country delivery capacity. I think those are the 2 biggest potential bottlenecks that have the potential to slow the global vaccine effort right now.
Sure.
While agreeing with both of Jeremy's points, I would say that don't worry about over-investing in the vaccine pipeline. Chances are we will end up over-investing, but it doesn't matter. It'll pay for itself many times over in the long run.
So I think to complement, I will say continue financing the further coverage for 2022, because we do have to think about the pivoting to 2022 and really support right now the development of dose sharing, the deployment of dose sharing, very important.
Great, you incredibly disciplined panelists, because I was, sort of budgeting enough time to make sure that we got time. But that means I can give you and the audience 5 minutes back into your very busy schedule this week. So let me just really thank you all, Marianne, Jeremy, Ashok, because this has been incredibly insightful, session, and of course the audience for all the questions. I think what we clearly heard today is not just the financing. It's the financing is critical, but so is the production, the supply, the getting the readiness sorted. It's as Ashok put it earlier, is the importance of investing in the entire vaccine pipeline, from research to production to delivery, to making sure that the countries can actually receive it. There are a lot of barriers, but it's obvious that it has to be a priority. These collective global efforts need to happen, and who better than the wealthiest countries to really help sort of lift this. And in many ways it's important to also remember how small, after all, the cost of this global vaccination effort really is globally, compared to the benefits that it can have for the global economy. The IMF estimated a $9 trillion kind of benefit in terms of the impact for the global economy. In many ways the future cost of inaction for the global economy will be far greater than financing and sort of really pushing the global vaccination program right now. So I think as we wrap up, we really leaving with a lot more food for thought and really useful perspective that you have shared. Many ways that the very best time to provide the necessary resources and support for the global vaccination effort may have been last year, but the second best time is now. So let's really make sure that we see this lift, and we now have to wait and see if the G7 leaders this weekend do take the necessary action to rapidly move forward towards vaccine equity. The US has got us to a really good start. Let's hope that the other countries follow. As ODI, we will continue to push for action in the lead up to these moments, G7 now, G20 later in October, and really look forward to seeing you all to future conversations and events. Thank you all, particularly our panelists, and wishing you all well.